As we've discussed in more than a few Tech on Demand videos and podcasts, the key to successfully producing high-quality crops often starts at the very beginning, and that is especially true with the crop we're discussing today. And how you and your team approach the earliest stages of germination and propagation sets the stage for uniformity down the line. I'm very happy to welcome back frequent guest, Dr. Will Healy. Will recently retired as senior manager of Ball's Technical Services Group, but he continues to think about ways to share his knowledge and decades of experience working with growers around the world. This time, he's here to focus on seed-raised begonias. Will, we have talked about a lot of different crops over the years, but not begonias. And I'm really not sure why, but now is the time to turn the spotlight on begonias. And why do you feel that begonias are worthy of a crop-specific discussion?
Well, Bill, I would say that of all the crops that I've dealt with, begonias have got to be one of the most mysterious and perplexing crops I've ever had. For 30 years, I've been working with young plant suppliers, trying to figure out, how did you do that? Where you have one tray that is absolutely uniform, and right next to it, you've got this tray that's totally all over the place. Everything from no-shows, where there's absolutely no seedling, to plants that are all ready to transplant. We've done research on growing them in chambers, and suddenly we take what had historically been like an 8-week crop, and after 21 days, we're ready to ship it. It's been kind of the great mystery crop of all times. I even had a graduate student, 30 years ago who did a study where they looked at the effects of temperature, and it was like amazing the difference that temperature made. But how do you end up with, as we see in our introduction, how do you end up with one seedling that is like going gangbusters and the other? So what I want to share with you now is, how did people do this? Because we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out, how do you do that? How do you make uniform and non-uniform crops in the same tray?
Well, that makes sense. And when we were chatting about this, you said this is a crop that separates the men from the boys. And I love that analogy. But it's also a crop that if you can get it right in the first 2 weeks, then you're probably kind of set up for success. So I do like bedding begonias. There are a lot of bang for your buck in big garden beds and in landscapes, and we see a lot of them. I also really like tuberous begonias and boliviensis, and we've seen so many new interspecifics come to market. So why don't we make sure that we touch on those as well throughout the presentation, or maybe toward the end if you want to give some tips on those. But enough out of me. Why don't you go ahead and get started? And if I have questions, I'll go ahead and jump in and ask them.
Excellent. Yeah, because, at the end of the day, Bill, they're begonias. Now, there's some little nuances depending upon, there's semperflorens, or they're tuber hybrida, or if they're interspecifics, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, there are some basic rules that you have to follow. And so that's what we're really going to focus on today. So let's start back at, if you listen to any of the other ones, we always know about how do we really focus this discussion. It's all about germination. How do we get the most uniform germination possible? So, of course, germination process begins when you absorb water. So once you drop that seed and you put water on it, you have made a commitment to be successful or fail. Very important to keep that in mind, especially with begonias, as you'll see. And that basically the germination process ends with the hypocotyl, or with the stem. And in this case, this is going to be an important part of why people fail, is because of that stem. Because think of begonias as an unrooted cutting. Begonias are really weird. It didn't happen until many years after we've been trying to figure out how they do that. When we went and we pulled some seedlings, the cotyledons had unfolded, we pulled them out, we put them under a microscope, and lo and behold, they look like unrooted cuttings. There was no root. It's just basically, it's the hypocotyl, which is that little stem that's underneath the cotyledons, and it's no roots. Now there's root initials, but this became a really critical key to success, is understanding that this is not a petunia after all. Begonias are different. And they, because of this no root at the time the hypocotyl extends, that becomes a key to success or failure. So we're going to really talk about that. So the getting that hypocotyl to elongate is really the technical end of germination. But in the case of begonias, there's a lot more to it, because you can basically get the cotyledons to unfold in like 5, 6, maybe 7 days, depending upon temperature, and we'll talk about that. But what happens is that it's the next 5 to 7 days as the roots development that basically gives you uniform or ununiform crops. And this is where people start to fail. Once you got a uniform crop, you're good to go. So let's talk about synchronizing. We're trying to synchronize cotyledon unfolding. And this doesn't really have to do with germination, but it has to do with mechanical parts of what we're doing. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you mechanically screw up begonia germination so that they become asynchronous and they don't all germinate, because there really is not a bad begonia. Begonias have probably the highest germination of any product that we produce in the seedlings business. It has a 99% germination. So it has a very high germination rate for semperflorens, but yet there's no shows. And if you don't have a seedling that shows up, well, obviously you're not going to have it. If it's showed up late, it's basically going to flower late, it's going to develop late. And, if you take a look at all these trays in front of us today, we've tried everything under the sun to make this more uniform, but nothing works like getting it right from the very beginning at the time that you are sowing. So we're going to really talk about that. Something that we really haven't talked about too much about germination in some of our other presentations is that temperature is really critical, because when we take a look at begonias, we have to remember that they're warm-blooded. Begonias, pentas, vinca, canna, these are all warm-blooded products. What do I mean? Well, they're native to, they originated in tropical moist climates of South America, most of the begonias. So they're not used to the cold temperatures of the north where we're producing them. And in fact, what usually happens is that we produce them very early in the winter, December, January, regardless of where you are, and that temperature is cold. Bill, have you ever experienced cold water coming out of your tap?
I have, and I can't imagine as a very tender seedling really enjoying that cold weather.
Right. And so what happens is you put that 50-degree or even colder water onto that tray, and it drops the temperature for multiple days. Another problem that we have is that even if you have warm water, the long nights with that water evaporating, because remember, you're putting heat in that greenhouse, and that heat is causing the humidity to to basically causing evaporation from the tray, and evaporation cools it. It's not uncommon for you to see the soil temperature anywhere between 5-10 degrees cooler than the air temperature that you think you have. And this is a really key part of it. So as soon as that soil temperature where the seed is starts dropping down below 70 degrees, you're in trouble. And that's probably what slows the process down. And those that are growing vigorously, they just get that first true leaf and they're off and running. They don't care what temperature it is. But up to that point where you have that first true leaf, it's really critical that you don't cool that soil down. And we can have a good example of that. This is an example where the air and soil temperature were 70 degrees. And of course, throughout the course of the night, the temperature in and around that seed dropped to probably about 65. Now, what does that really make a difference? I mean, those look okay, but look at what happens when we look at what happens if we use tempered water, where we're basically putting warm water on them. So we're not throwing 50-degree water, but we basically have water that's about 68 to 70 degree Fahrenheit. Notice how much better and faster those seedlings develop. These are very warm-blooded products that really don't like to be cold. They don't like to be chilled, kind of like people. Now, a word of caution. Some people say a little warm water is good. A lot must be better, right, Bill?
Nope, not in this case.
Oh, no. What we see is that when you start getting water temperatures above 80 degrees, Fahrenheit, you start have potential for causing tip abortion and other problems. We've, of course, learned that the hard way by basically having 90, 100-degree water coming through the system and basically scorching plants and almost killing them. So, a little bit is good, Bill. A lot is nothing but trouble. So, but tempered water is really critical for begonias. It doesn't hurt on other crops either, but begonias are really sensitive to this. So make sure that you've got tempered water to keep the plants growing. And that's why when you grow them in chambers, you don't end up with the drop in temperature, and you basically have this lit chamber that stays at a constant temperature through the entire growing cycle, that they actually reduce the crop time almost in half.
Oh, wow.
Shocking, but it's a way that if you've got really long crop times, temper your water, fairly inexpensive, especially compared to chambers, and you'll see magic happen. So let's talk about the germination process, because there's a step in here that's really critical. Remember that you need to melt the pellet or dissolve the and get it to melt. You need to get that seed coat to absorb water, and the water moves into the inner membrane. Now, the thing you have to remember about begonias, it's probably the smallest seed that we use in the entire bedding plant industry. To say that it's dust is really an insult to dust, because a lot of dust is bigger. It is really, really small. That's why it's pelleted, Bill, so that it's pelleted so that you can easily handle it. To try to sow raw begonias is almost impossible. So so you need to make sure that you get that water on and you don't bury that seed with too much water. Now, the next step is this whole issue of light. Light, as I mentioned earlier, is really important to get uniformity. It's not that it doesn't germinate in the dark, but it does require light. So making sure they don't get buried, make sure that you've got uniform light, very, very critical, as we'll see in a minute. Remember that once the starch breaks down, the machinery starts getting activated, cells start to multiply, elongation begins, and then that all requires oxygen. So we need to make sure that we go through wet and dry cycles to force oxygen back in, so that you don't end up with the seed just basically sitting in water, or worse, where you put on so much water that you start getting algae, which basically prevents the oxygen from getting in there. Once that seed coat cracks, basically the hypocotyl emerges, and as we mentioned before, it's like an unrooted cutting. The cotyledons unfold, but there is no root. And so we can't stress enough to think of the begonia seedling as an unrooted cutting. If you come away with nothing else in this entire conversation today, make sure that you think of begonias differently than any other crop. In fact, I would encourage you to go take some seedlings where the cotyledons have unfolded, pull them out and put them under a 10, 15x scope or a magnifying glass and look at them and see, yeah, he's right, they aren't any. And how do you know that you've got a root forming? Well, this is really kind of an interesting thing, is that as soon as you start seeing that first true leaf push out, most likely there's a root going down. Now, that doesn't mean that you can just ignore it at that point, because as that true leaf comes out and that root goes down, it's a very, very fine root. And what happens, and this is where the ununiformity starts showing up, is that you dry out that soil. And as we all know from rooting cuttings, is if you dry out the soil, what happens, Bill?
Well, you're not going to grow a root.
Right. The roots, and actually you can see that root, if you put it under that magnifying glass, you can actually watch it shrivel up and die. That's how we knew we've got to watch out for that top, probably 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch of soil, that we manage that moisture very critically. But let's first talk about light, because it's so important. We saw this picture earlier, and once the seed is hydrated, and this is really kind of weird, because once you throw that water on it, light is important. If you remember back a couple slides where he said light is right there, up there, right with hydration, it's really important. We learned this, of course, the hard way. And you don't have to have high intensity lighting. You don't have to have LEDs. You just have to have presence of light. That's why a lot of people germinate on the bench versus in a chamber. Even a chamber, you can hold temperature better, but unless you've got uniform light in there, well, this is what you've got. In fact, in the chamber, you can't have any dark areas. If we take a look at this, we're always mystified by this, where you end up with, this is all the same variety, laid down at the same time, And you'd come by and you see, why do you have this one tray that is absolutely beautiful? Well, we've come to find out that the grower had a small light in their chamber that they used so that they could go in and see how things are developing. And so what we saw is that the top shelf is, because it had the presence of light during that early stage of germination, uniform, often going. The edge of the shelf, down one, where there's still some light, notice that you do have some, you have the benefit of the light. And then, of course, the bottom shelf, they're not bad seedlings. In fact, they're very uniform. Notice they're pretty uniform in that tray, but they're very much delayed. So it's very important to have light. Now, how many hours? As you'll learn later on, 14, 16 hours or even night interruption is what's critical. But light, you've got to have light to get uniform, speedy germination. And to test this out, we actually did a small trial where we basically had trays where we had light on the edge versus dark, and then we had the bottom shelf, and you can see it very clearly. So this really cemented in my mind light is important. So let's talk about the soil moisture at flat filling. This is kind of one of the sleepers that was very hard to sort out, making sure that you've got the right moisture levels and uniform. Now, one of the problems, make sure that when you're using a mixer, that you're using some kind of a nozzle, whether it's a faucet nozzle or some kind of a nozzle to uniformly spray the water versus just a stream in there where you have really wet spots surrounded by very dry pockets, because that then gives you the performance that we're seeing in this particular image, where you have very ununiform. It's because they didn't have uniform moisture. Now, sometimes it's very obvious. We have cells that are dried out, but other times that you have soil on the bottom that's not uniform, and it's kind of hidden by the by water being applied to the top. So where did we find the biggest problem, the biggest culprit, the biggest reason why we ended up with these dry pockets? Well, it has to do with the fact that begonias normally have a very long crop time, and so people sow them first thing in the week. And of course, the first thing they do is they turn on their machines, which have a lot of dry soil in them. We've talked about this in the past, where the flat filler should be the single cleanest piece of equipment in your entire operation. You should not have any dry soil. And when you have dry soil sitting on the edges, that falls in and that creates dry pockets. These dry pockets then become ununiform moisture, which will remember the very first stage, uniform moisture is critical for germination. And then if you have dried underneath, then basically you nip the roots so they don't develop. Let's talk about centering and light, because centering the seed in the middle of the cell is very important. Notice that all of these pellets are basically off center. Notice they're not dead center. And this is really important with begonias because you want to have that begonia right in the middle so it's easier to manage. Here we've got an example of where the dibbler was basically not matched to the tray. And so what happens is the dibbler scoops the soil out, which then when you go and put the water on it, you have a tendency to bury that seed. And of course, we can see that if you look very carefully, you can see how that there's a little bit of a ledge in that tray. So it's very important when we're starting to look at are we burying that seed or not, that we basically look to see, do we have the drum, the dibbler, and the tray is a match set. You don't go and have change the tray, because that's going to change where the dibble is. So look really carefully. Make sure that that dibbler is actually putting a nice dibble in the middle of that tray, and that you're dropping that seed with the seeder in the middle, so you don't end up with the challenge of burying the seed. And this is one of those just really subtle little pieces that we find that gives you this weird pattern. In fact, you can actually see patterns in the tray where the seed has been buried. Let's talk about the water tunnel, because this is truly where the magic begins. You can't have too much. Some people say, well, we're going to put on a lot of water, make sure we're adequately wet. Well, one of the problems that you run into with a water tunnel is that you can very easily bury the seed. As you can see here, this particular water tunnel had a lot of water in certain areas. And basically, there's not bad seed there, they're just buried. And so until you actually wash the soil off that pellet so that it gets light, it of course doesn't germinate. So this is where having that seed exposed to the light, not buried, is really important so that you end up with a uniform germination. Notice that we really focus on nozzle number one is basically enough water to glue that seed down. And then the remaining nozzles are used to get the right amount of moisture so that you are actually putting on your target moistures. And with begonias, I would definitely make sure that you end up with the right moisture before you sow. So weigh trays that have been filled so that you know that you've got enough soil, you've got enough moisture in that tray, and that it's ready to go so that then when it goes through the water tunnel, that it will have the right amount of moisture coming out of the tunnel, and that you're recording this, because this is one of the problems that you see is that 20, 30 days after you sow them, you now see problems on uniformity and all kinds of issues. And you kind of go like, well, what happened? Well, with most crops, there's short enough crop time that you can kind of trace back. But with begonias, what we found, until we started recording the moisture levels at the time of sowing, did we finally realize, that is a problem. And we fixed the moisture level at the time of sowing, and suddenly we end up with uniform trays. So you need that data to basically go back and check, why did that happen? Keeping good records is critical. Now, you don't have to weigh every tray. Every 5, 10, 15 trays is more than enough to know that, whoops, we're kind of wandering away. It also helps your crew understand this is important. If they record it, it is perceived as important. So you need to make sure that they're recording it, and they just don't always record the same number, because then they're I know, Bill, you never dry labbed a science project, but
Never.
Never. But some people will just get frustrated and just always write 1400.
Mm-hmm.
That is physically impossible. So make sure that the numbers vary, but not too much.
Is this specific to, not burying the seed and sort of the danger of doing that, is that more so because the seed pellet is so small, or is that just because, is part of it just because begonias need a little bit more care early on, or is there an extra danger with tiny seed?
Well, no, I think, Bill, you've got the right. It starts out with the seed is really tiny,
mm-hmm.
The soil is really big, so it's really hard. It's really easy to hide a seed underneath a chunk of peat.
Okay.
So, and then that basically puts it in the dark, which of course we understand, and then and that's where the death spiral starts of lack of uniformity. So you can say, is it the lack of light? Well, light comes into play if the seed is exposed, but if it's not exposed, then until it sees light, it's not going to germinate very well.
Right.
And if you put too much water, then you can bury the seed and push that seed down because it is so small. And remember, there's so many. If you look at a chunk of peat, in the tray, there's all kinds of little cracks and crevices that a begonia seed could just fall into and disappear. That's the problem. So that's why it's really important that you monitor your pellet melting, and that's where you don't dry them out. I can't tell you how many times people don't put the right amount of they put the right amount of moisture, so they got 1,400 grams coming off the end of that water tunnel. Okay. They pick the tray up and they put it on a rack. And then what happens at midday, Bill?
Go to lunch and all those racks sit in the head house.
And how low is the relative humidity? Oh, there is none.
Yeah, it's pretty dry in there.
And they basically dry out those pellets. So they end up looking like the ones in the picture, where they're basically rock hard. And let me assure you that once you've dried out a pellet, trying to get that pellet to dissolve is darn near impossible, because basically what happens is when they build the pellet, they put a binder on the outside to hold it so that it can survive handling. Well, when you add a little bit of water, it kind of drives that binder into the pellet so that it becomes a ball bearing. And you can literally, these pellets that we see that have been hardened, you can roll them around your finger. They don't break down. And that tells you that you let the moisture levels drop down. So the best management practice, the BMPs, is to sow and not leave it sitting around for any length of time. So when they go on break, there should be no begonia trays or any pelleted seed trays sitting out there. If you have to keep them on a rack for a period of time, then you may want to put a little extra moisture. You may want to go to 1450 instead of 1400, just so that it has a little bit of moisture to dry out if necessary in transit. If you have dry, there's going to be dry, then adjust the moisture. And that's where people need to play with the moisture target levels. These were just suggestions, merely recommendations that people use. But everyone needs to kind of develop their own. This is what we want our target for our operational. And it's really important on begonias, petunias also, but begonias are really sensitive to this. And of course, one of the big mistakes people make is that they basically say, okay, well, you need to keep it moist, and initially that's important. The first 4 or 5 days, you need to make sure you keep them moist so you get the pellet melted, and you can basically get the seed to hydrate and then to get the hypocotyl. But then if you keep it too wet, so you're pounding it with water, then you start running algae and crust. And this is because you've kept it constant level 4 plus. So you need to oscillate between 4 and 3. Wet's 4, dry it back to 3. And that's really important so that you don't get that crust formation. And of course, we talk about how you can grow crust in algae in a different podcast, which I'm sure that Bill, you'll have it in the tip in the notes.
I will. I'll put it in the show notes and attempt to drop a link down here at the bottom of the video.
Good. And then the melting the pellet is really important because this is where we talked about this is a perfect example of some dianthus where they sowed it and then they basically went to lunch. And then when they went to lunch, some of the pellets had dissolved a little bit, it opened up, and others had just turned hard. And those are ball bearings. And as you can see, a number of days, like 3 to 4 weeks later, you still have pellets there. That tells you you've got a dry out occurrence somewhere. What we'd like to have you do is do the pencil test. That's just taking a pointed pencil and touching that pellet to see, does it break apart nicely. These are some pellets that after moisture, probably about 8 hours later, you can actually see the pellet starting to crumble a bit and opening up to allow it to see light. And of course, at that point, if you were to touch it with a pencil, it basically will open up nicely. You want to make sure that you're keeping it moist. So what you can do is keep the floors wet, which keeps the humidity high, because that pellet's sitting out there in the great outdoors of your greenhouse, drying out if the humidity gets too low. So really be focusing on what's the humidity, not how much water do we put on, but what's the humidity, the vapor pressure deficit in our greenhouse. Those of who you propagate understand vapor pressure deficit, and you may want to set up a VPD in your begonia germination area so that you don't end up with a situation where it is too dry. Fog is another benefit as long as you don't keep it too wet. Notice that these pellets are really nicely starting to crack apart, but be aware of it. Now, ideally, what you want to see is by day 3, and you'll start seeing is you truly see this bowl of oatmeal, or if you were Japanese, tofu, and you can actually see the seed. Now, it takes a pretty good eye to do it. This is just a picture of it, and then you basically blow it up and you can actually see it. That tells you are in good shape. Those are begonias, by the way. So you can see how a begonia could easily fall into a crack and crevice and be hidden. And that's one of the benefit of having that pellet powder melting, is it creates like a little pedestal for that seed to be exposed to light, to keep it moist. And that pellet powder is wet, so it keeps it moist. And that can't be said enough. Now, we've talked a little bit about water by weight. And this is a good example where they've gone through the different cycles where they've set their targets. In this case, they've set for a crop where they have 1,200 to 1,000 for hydration. Then they basically have got a little bit drier, not a lot, but just slightly drier. They aren't adding as much water to the wet target. They're keeping keeping the wet target a little bit tighter. And then finally, once the hypocotyl elongation and cotyledon forms, they have. Now, this is kind of compressed compared to begonias, but let's see what happens in begonias and how you create ununiformity. This is a good example of an ununiform crop, and we went back to the data because, of course, when they do water by weight, when they record the weight of the tray, 4 or 5 trays, they just to kind of give the growers a sense of how dry are we, and they have their wet target up here, and they also have got their dry targets, and this is after basically the hypocotyl is extended and we're developing roots. Notice that there's several occasions where they drop below the dry target. And that, remember, when you drop below the dry target, what dries out first, Bill, is of course the top of the soil. And where's that begonia seedling?
Sitting on top.
And so that top 1/8 of an inch is really critical to prevent the excess dry down. And so what happens is that every time that drops down below the red line there, you're basically nuking that root, so it's dead, and then the seedling has to throw another root. Okay, and then you basically, 2 days later, you nuke the roots again, and it starts all over again. So if you wonder why on the picture on the left, we've got some seedlings that are just rolling past that first true leaf stage without a problem, and others are just starting to poke true leaves out. Those were the ones that were nuked several times by just inadvertently drying them out. This is where, when we said that it separates the men from the boys, it's really right here where it's critical, in that once that cotyledon unfolds, detail, staying on top of the detail is very important. If people, and time and again, we have growers telling us, we've always had good begonias and suddenly we don't. And the first question is, okay, so did you have someone different doing the germination? Well, yeah, he left, we moved him, he did a good job, we made him a manager. And I said, okay, the problem is the person you replaced them with. They didn't have that attention to detail at this very critical stage of development. So that's what we really want to focus on, because remember, it basically causes root damage and it delays or stunted. There are no bad begonias. They're just stunted or delayed. So when we want to have a nice uniform first true leaf come out, as you can see, most of these have either a first true leaf or they're basically moving along. What do we need to know? You have to remember that handling as an unrooted cutting is critical. Light immediately after the water tunnel to keep it moving. Keep it warm. Use that tempered water. Avoid burying the seed by pounding them with too much water. Weekends are disastrous to begonias. That's why it's always good to sow them on Monday so that they have a chance to not be overwatered on the weekend. That weekend watering where someone goes in and says, well, I'm just going to pour some water on these so they're good for a day or two until we come back. That's where the problem starts showing in. Make sure that you melt the pellet. Don't bury the pellet. Make sure you oscillate between that level 3 and level 4. And then finally, let's put a little fertilizer on these. Earlier, as soon as you start seeing the cotyledons unfolding, because it's really important to have a little 20-10-20, a little ammonia to push those leaves out, get big leaves so that you can start losing water through the leaves, through the cotyledons. In the picture, we see a plant on the right that particular plug was not fertilized for probably until about day 21, whereas the plant on the left was fertilized pretty much at a low rate, 50, 75 parts per million, right from the time that the cotyledons unfolded. As soon as they started moving to regular watering cycles, that's when they started putting feed on it. As you can see, you have several more leaves, bigger leaves, better root growth, overall better performance. Because begonias have such a long crop time, you tend to leach all the soil, all the fertilizer out of that soil. So you really don't have a charge. So the plants just basically, they don't starve to death. They just don't grow very well. So does that give us a good start, Bill, on how do we achieve uniform? Because once you got that first true leaf out, Bill, we can make you the grower and you can finish them off. How's that?
I don't know. You always say that, Will, and that's a really scary thought. But it does make a lot of sense. And the points that you make are um, they're the kind of points that you can use to train new growers and to really go over every season with your production team, just so that everybody's on the same page.
Exactly. And keeping them reminding that even on the weekends, this is important, because otherwise the weekends you're going to screw it up every time, because that was another one of the sleepers. We couldn't figure out, okay, the germination's good. Why are they uneven? Until we finally one weekend paid attention to what was going on. It was like, oh, well, that explains it. And it was like every other weekend or every third weekend. And how often do people work on the weekend? Well, every second or third weekend.
Right. You're rotating the crew.
And so we found out who the guilty person is, and we trained them. We didn't take them out to the back fence and shoot them, because we still need them. So
Right.
we don't want to chastise them. We don't want to make them feel bad. We just want to train them to do the job correctly. So this is where it's very important to have that training, have the logs of when, at what point did they water, what was the weight at the time of the watering decision, both for, and how much did they apply, not just how dry did it get, but how wet did they make it? Because both of those points are very critical in the success of begonias.
No, that's good. Do you want to touch on some of the other types of seed raised begonias before we wrap up?
Yeah, let's talk about the other begonia species, because there's basically three big groups that are quite prevalent. There's the interspecific. These are the begonia, the megawatts, the top hats. They're basically different species to give you this big, bulky, beautiful plant material. They are in their heart a semperflorens. So if you treat them like a semperflorens, they're going to perform. Now, the germination is not as good as a straight semperflorens, so you may have to be really sensitive to the light and moisture issue. But if you get a good seed that's fresh, it performs like it. The tuber
Do
hybrid,
dragon wings and baby wings fit into this
yes,
category?
yeah, they do fit in there also. Good point. The tuberous begonias are, and they form tubers, and how you prevent them from forming tubers is you grow them under long days. And you have to do this from germination. So you can tell whether a begonia is going to be a problem, because if they form a tuber, they don't flower and branch uniformly.
Right.
So they're very poor performing. So you really want to get that long days on them, and skipping 1 or 2 days might not be a problem, but skipping 5-6 days is going to be a problem. So long days from the time you sold them until the days actually start getting long. Night interruption can be okay. It doesn't have to be high pressure sodium or LED lights. Either one of them is good, but you do have to have long days. They're also warmer blooded, so that you absolutely can't drop that temperature below 77, especially for germination, because germination just gets too slowed down. The Boliviensis is kind of the new kid on the block. And these are like the Bossa Nova, the Santa Cruz, Santa Barbara, etc., that whole series. They also require long days because they will form tubers. And they also have a little bit warmer than semperflorens conditions, but if they will tolerate, you can grow them side by side with semperflorens, but they probably, if you're growing a number of different begonias, grow the Boliviensis with the tuber hybrid, the tuberous begonias, for better success. So that kind of gives us the information that we need. Does that kind of wrap up what we need, Bill?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, you've covered quite a bit. Hopefully, folks, the viewers and listeners will internalize some of this information. And like I said before, share it with your team. Make sure that everybody starts their begonia germination correctly. And then hopefully after a couple of weeks, once you've got roots and true leaves, you can move on and set them out and kind of let them go. And I love that you always put this slide at the end, because it reminds me to remind the viewers and listeners about all of the multimedia resources we have for Tech on Demand. I do a weekly newsletter where I share a lot of information. It tends to be very timely, so I talk about what's happening that week. So if you're listening to this or viewing this in real time, it is freezing cold out. So I'm talking about receiving cuttings when it's cold out and not when it's warm out. So The newsletter tends to be very timely. We have more than 150 videos on Ball Seed's YouTube channel, covering a range of topics from beginner level new grower information all the way to, most advanced, how to set your VPD controls up. Podcasts, we have more than 100 podcasts covering, again, a wide range of topics, all cultural and technical related. And the Facebook group, a peer-to-peer community. You can search that on Facebook by searching Greenhouse Tech Team and answer a couple simple questions, and I'll let you right in. It is a closed Facebook group for professionals in our industry only. Will, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I'm sure we'll be doing this again with some more crops, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Good. And we actually have a few queued up, so when we get around to recording them, we will be sure to share them with all of you. I am Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand, reminding you to subscribe to the Ball Seed YouTube channel for all these videos. Subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. We're on all the major apps. And above all else, have a great season and take care out there.